My own daughter locked me and my husband in our basement like animals, thinking our age made us helpless. She was wrong. My name is Beatrice Caldwell. I'm 79 years old, and I've spent more than half a century building something real in this world. My husband Cornelius and I raised 3 children in our Victorian home in Connecticut, turned a single rental property into an empire of 20 buildings, and earned respect in a community that doesn't give it freely. We survived recessions, family funerals, and 53 years of marriage with our integrity intact. But nothing prepares you for the moment your own child decides you're worth more dismantled than whole. That Tuesday afternoon started like any other weekly lunch with Lorraine and her husband Mark. By evening, I was sitting in the dark on a concrete floor, listening to my husband's labored breathing, wondering if we'd die in the house we built with our own hands. Lorraine stood on the other side of that locked door and told us we'd stay there until we signed over everything we owned. She thought 79 meant fragile. She thought age meant defeat. What she didn't know was that old houses keep secrets, and old people know where they're hidden. This is the story of how I took back everything she tried to steal, and in the process, destroyed the one thing she valued more than our property, her precious social status built on a lie about who we really are. If you want to see how a grandmother deals with betrayal when her back's against the wall, stay with me. And if you're the kind of person who believes family means something, hit that subscribe button, because you're going to want to see how this ends. The warning signs had been there for months, but when you're nearly 80, people expect you to miss things. They count on it. It started last spring when Lorraine began visiting more frequently, always with that concerned expression she'd perfected. She'd walk through our home touching things, the Tiffany lamp in the foyer, the Persian rug in the study, the antique sideboard that had belonged to Cornelius's adoptive mother. Her fingers would linger like she was already measuring for new furniture. During those visits, she'd drop comments about how difficult the stairs must be for us, how the house was too much responsibility at our age. She used words like downsizing and assisted living, with a gentleness that made my skin crawl. Mark would nod along, playing the dutiful son-in-law, though I noticed he spent most of his time calculating property values on his phone. The real shift came when Lorraine joined the Heritage Club, that insufferable social organization where Connecticut's elite pretend their money makes them better than everyone else. Suddenly, being a Caldwell wasn't just her married name. It was her identity. She'd introduce herself at charity events as Lorraine Caldwell of the Langston Caldwell family, as if her father-in-law's adoptive father's reputation somehow made her royalty. That Tuesday, she arrived in a new Mercedes, the kind that costs more than most people's annual salary. Mark followed in his own car, which should have been my first real warning. They never drove separately. Lunch was tense from the start. Lorraine picked at her food while Mark kept checking his watch. Finally, she pushed a folder across the mahogany table, the same table where we'd hosted her birthday parties as a child. She told me it was a simple power of attorney, just paperwork to make things easier as we got older. Her voice had that syrupy quality people use when they're lying to someone they think is stupid. She said it would help her manage our medical decisions, pay our bills, handle the properties. I've been signing contracts since before Lorraine was born. I recognized a property transfer document when I saw one. When I refused, her mask slipped. She told me I was being unreasonable, that I didn't understand modern estate planning. Mark finally spoke up, suggesting we were showing signs of confusion, that it might be early dementia. The words hung in the air like poison. That's when Cornelius stood up from the table. My husband, who'd been quiet through the whole meal, who'd let me handle the business discussions for years because his emphysema made talking difficult, stood up and told them to leave. Lorraine's face transformed. The concerned daughter vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. She told Mark to show us the basement problem. My husband and I followed Mark down those wooden stairs we'd walked 1,000 times. He pointed to a water stain near the foundation, talking about potential flooding. We bent to look closer, trusting like fools. And that's when I heard Lorraine's heels clicking on the stairs behind us. The door slammed before I could turn around. The lock clicked with a sound that echoed through my chest. Lorraine's voice came through the thick wood, no longer sweet or concerned. She informed us we'd stay down there until we were ready to be reasonable. She said the house was wasted on people who could barely climb stairs. She mentioned how embarrassing it was to tell her Heritage Club friends that her parents still controlled prime Connecticut real estate when they should be in a home. The basement went dark as she flipped the light switch from outside. Cornelius grabbed my hand in the blackness. His breathing was rough, rattling in his chest the way it does when he's stressed. I felt him shaking. Or maybe that was me. We'd built this house in 1978. We'd raised our children here. We'd buried our friends and celebrated anniversaries in these rooms. And now we were prisoners in our own foundation. I heard them moving around upstairs. Furniture scraped across floors. Drawers opened and closed. They were searching for something. Probably our financial documents, the property deeds, anything they could use. Hours passed. The cold seeped through my cardigan, the one Cornelius gave me on our 50th anniversary. My knees ached from standing. I thought about the irony of spending my final years in the real estate business, understanding property value down to the last dollar, only to become property myself in the eyes of my own daughter. That's when Cornelius pulled me close in the darkness. His breath was warm against my ear despite the cold basement air. He whispered that I should stay quiet and follow him. In 40 years of marriage, I'd learned to trust that tone in his voice, the one that said he'd been thinking, planning, remembering something the rest of us had forgotten. I'd heard it when he found the loophole that saved our first building from foreclosure, when he negotiated the deal that made our fortune, when he solved problems everyone else thought were impossible. My husband moved through the darkness like he could see, leading me behind the old furnace to a section of wall I'd forgotten existed. Cornelius's hands found mine in the dark, guiding my fingers to a brick that jutted out slightly from the wall. I could barely see his face, just the outline of his profile in the thin light that crept under the basement door. He told me he'd loosened this brick in 1984, the year his adoptive father Langston died. His voice was barely audible over the sound of Lorraine's footsteps pacing above us. He'd hidden something here that Langston made him promise to keep safe, something that could destroy the Caldwell name if it ever came out. My heart was pounding as we worked the brick free. The mortar crumbled in my hands, 40 years of age making it easier than it should have been. Behind the brick was a gap in the wall, and inside that gap was a rusted tin box. The kind people used for important documents before fireproof safes became common. Cornelius held the box like it contained explosives. In a way, it did. We carried it to the small window that looked out at ground level, where the evening light gave us just enough illumination to see. My hands trembled as I opened the lid. Inside were papers yellowed with age, folded carefully and preserved in plastic sleeves. The first document I pulled out was a birth certificate. Not Cornelius's official one. I'd seen that plenty of times. This one listed his birth name as Cornelius Thorne, born to Orion Thorne and Margaret Brennan in 1943. The father's occupation was listed as research scientist. The second document was a letter, handwritten on Langston Caldwell's personal stationery, dated August 1951. I recognized Langston's handwriting from old business correspondence. My hands shook as I read his words, explaining how he'd arranged a private adoption to save young Cornelius from the scandal that would destroy him. Orion Thorne, his biological father, had been arrested for espionage, accused of passing research secrets to foreign powers during the Red Scare. The letter detailed how Langston, who'd lost his own son in the war, took in 8-year-old Cornelius and gave him the Caldwell name. He'd erased every trace of the Thorne connection, paid off records clerks, and created a new identity for the boy. In Connecticut society, Langston Caldwell's word was law. No one questioned when he introduced Cornelius as his late wife's nephew who'd come to live with him after a family tragedy. But here was the truth, preserved in Langston's own hand. Cornelius was the son of a convicted traitor, a man whose name had been dragged through newspapers and Senate hearings, a scandal that rocked the academic community in the 1950s. I looked at my husband in the dim light. He'd known this his whole life. He'd carried this weight for decades, building our business, raising our children, never once letting on that the prestigious Caldwell name he bore was a gift, not a birthright. He told me Langston made him promise never to reveal the truth. The old man had been terrified that the scandal would resurface, that Cornelius would be tainted by association, that everything they'd built would crumble. So Cornelius buried his past along with his biological father's memory, became the perfect Caldwell son, and pretended the Thorne name had never existed. But sitting on that cold basement floor, listening to our daughter celebrate her supposed victory upstairs, I realized what we were holding. Lorraine had built her entire social identity on being a Caldwell. She dropped the name at every opportunity, used it to gain entry to clubs and committees, wore it like a crown. Her friends at the Heritage Club included descendants of governors and industrial tycoons, families that traced their Connecticut roots back 2 centuries. To them, lineage was everything. Blood mattered, and the granddaughter of a convicted spy would be social poison. I heard Lorraine on the phone upstairs, her voice carrying through the floorboards. She was calling someone named Preston, her notary friend who'd helped her prepare the fraudulent power of attorney. She sounded giddy, telling him to prepare the property transfer documents, that her parents would sign anything after another few hours in the cold. Mark laughed in the background, making some comment about how easy it had been to manipulate the old folks. Cornelius started coughing, the kind of deep, racking cough that terrified me. His emphysema was getting worse, and the basement's dust and cold air were torture for his lungs. I held him until the coughing subsided, fury building in my chest. They thought we were helpless. They thought age had made us weak and stupid. They'd locked us away like inconvenient furniture, planning to steal our life's work while we shivered in the dark. But I had something Lorraine didn't know about, a weapon that would destroy her precious social standing more thoroughly than any lawsuit. And I had something else she'd overlooked in her rush to trap us, the old flip phone I kept in my cardigan pocket, the one she'd dismissed as a useless antique when she'd confiscated our smartphones. I pulled it out, the tiny screen glowing in the darkness. The battery showed 60%. Enough. I dialed the number I'd memorized 30 years ago, the direct line to Silas Moore's private office. Silas Moore answered on the 3rd ring. His voice had the gravel of a man who'd spent 5 decades practicing law in Connecticut's toughest courtrooms, but it softened when he recognized my number. I kept my voice low, barely above a whisper, telling him exactly what had happened. Silas had handled our business contracts since 1994. He'd negotiated our property acquisitions, defended us in tenant disputes, and drafted our wills. More importantly, he'd seen Lorraine grow from a sweet girl into the status-obsessed woman she'd become, and he'd warned me years ago that her obsession with social climbing would eventually turn dangerous. He asked if we were injured. I told him Cornelius's breathing was getting worse, that the basement was cold and damp, but we'd survive until morning. What I needed was for him to be ready with the right paperwork when the moment came. Silas understood immediately. He told me to document everything, keep that phone charged, and play along with whatever Lorraine wanted. Let her think she'd won. Let her get comfortable in her victory. The hardest part, he said, would be making her believe we'd broken. Around midnight, Lorraine finally opened the door. Light flooded down the stairs, making me squint after hours in near darkness. She stood at the top, backlit like some kind of avenging angel, except angels don't lock their parents in basements. I made sure I was hunched over, supporting Cornelius as he coughed. I let my voice shake when I called up to her, asking if we could please come upstairs. I told her we were ready to discuss her papers. Her smile was triumphant. She'd won, or so she thought. Mark helped us up the stairs, his hands gripping my arm with false gentleness. They'd set up the dining room table with documents spread across its surface, power of attorney forms, property transfer agreements, even a pre-drafted will that left everything to Lorraine. Preston the notary sat there with his stamp ready, looking uncomfortable but willing. I played my part perfectly. I let my hands shake as I reached for the pen. I squinted at the papers like I couldn't quite read them. I asked simple questions in a confused voice, the kind of questions that made Lorraine exchange knowing glances with Mark. But before I signed anything, I told her I needed to use the bathroom and take my medication. My heart pills, I said, the ones I take every night at the same time or risk complications. Lorraine waved me away impatiently, annoyed at the delay but not suspicious. Old people and their pills, she'd heard me talk about my medication routine 1,000 times. In the bathroom, I used those precious minutes to text Silas photographs of every document on that table. The phone's camera was terrible, but it was enough to show him what we were dealing with. He responded immediately with instructions. "Sign nothing tonight," he wrote. "Tell them you need your doctor's approval first, due to your heart condition. Use your health as leverage." When I returned, I apologized for being slow. I told Lorraine that I wanted to sign everything. Truly I did. But my cardiologist had given me strict instructions never to make major decisions or experience stress without his supervision. Something about heart attack risks in elderly patients with my condition. I watched Lorraine's face cycle through frustration, calculation, and finally reluctant acceptance. She couldn't risk me having a medical emergency before the papers were signed. Mark argued that we should do it anyway, but Preston the notary cleared his throat and mentioned something about documents signed under medical duress being challengeable in court. So Lorraine agreed to wait until Thursday, giving me 2 days to see my doctor. She made me promise to sign then, no more delays. I promised with my best, confused old lady smile, the one that made me look harmless and slightly addled. She allowed us to sleep in our own bed that night, but I noticed she'd taken our car keys and disabled the landline phone. She thought she'd covered all the exits. What she didn't know was that I'd spent those hours in the basement memorizing every word of Langston's letter, every detail of Cornelius's true birth certificate. I'd photographed them with my old phone while she was busy gloating upstairs. Over the next 2 days, I played the defeated elderly woman perfectly. I shuffled around the house in my slippers, let Lorraine dictate my meals, and pretended to be too tired to do much besides sit in my chair. I even asked her advice on simple decisions, making her feel powerful and in control. Meanwhile, I was texting Silas. He was gathering everything we needed: evidence of the false imprisonment, documentation of Lorraine's coercion, and most importantly, he was preparing to deploy the nuclear option hidden in that tin box. Cornelius played his part too, though it cost him. His breathing grew worse from the basement exposure, and he had to use his nebulizer more frequently. But he backed up everything I said, acting confused and defeated, letting Lorraine believe she'd broken us both. Thursday morning, Lorraine announced that instead of a doctor's visit, we'd be signing the papers at her house on Sunday. She'd arranged for a small gathering. Her closest friends from the Heritage Club would be there to witness our generous gift to our devoted daughter. She wanted an audience for her victory. I agreed with a tired smile, telling her whatever she wanted was fine with me. That's when I knew she'd made her fatal mistake. She'd given me a stage. Friday morning, while Lorraine was at her Heritage Club luncheon, I called Silas from the back garden where she couldn't hear me. The azaleas were blooming, the same ones Cornelius and I had planted in 1979, and I found something steadying about standing among things we'd nurtured for decades while planning how to save them. Silas told me he'd filed an emergency petition with the court, but he needed more than my testimony. Judges saw elder abuse cases constantly, and without hard evidence, it often came down to a he said, she said between generations. Adult children hired expensive lawyers who painted their parents as confused, unreliable, suffering from dementia. But evidence of false imprisonment? That was criminal. And evidence that the power of attorney was obtained through coercion? That invalidated everything. I told him about the security system Cornelius had installed 5 years ago, the one with cameras in every major room. Lorraine thought we'd disconnected it because we couldn't figure out the smartphone app, but the truth was simpler. We'd kept it running and recording to cloud storage because our insurance company required it. The footage of her locking us in the basement was sitting on a server somewhere, time-stamped and undeniable. Silas made a sound that might have been a laugh. He said he'd subpoena the footage immediately and have it ready for Sunday. But then he asked about the documents from the tin box, the birth certificate and letter. Did I understand what I was really planning to do with them? I understood perfectly. I was going to destroy my daughter's carefully constructed identity in front of the people whose opinions she valued most. I was going to expose a family secret that had been buried for 70 years. And yes, I knew it would hurt Cornelius too, revealing that the man everyone respected as a self-made Caldwell was actually the adopted son of a convicted traitor. But Cornelius was dying anyway. His emphysema was in its final stages. We both knew he had months, maybe a year if we were lucky. He'd told me the previous night, wheezing in the darkness of our bedroom, that he was tired of carrying Langston's shame. He said if his real identity was the price of protecting our legacy from Lorraine's greed, it was a price he'd gladly pay. Saturday, I spent the day going through our files. Lorraine had searched the house, but she'd looked for deeds and bank statements. She hadn't bothered with the boxes in the attic, the ones filled with 50 years of correspondence and records. I found what I needed in a box labeled 1990s Business. Inside were letters between Cornelius and various Connecticut historical societies, documents showing our donations to preservation projects, copies of checks made out to charities. More importantly, I found the pattern. Every donation, every charitable contribution had been made through our company, Caldwell Properties, LLC, not through the Heritage Club or any of Lorraine's social organizations. We'd given millions over the years to actual causes, hospitals and schools and community centers. Lorraine gave to organizations that required a board seat and a name plaque. She donated to be seen donating. I compiled everything into a folder, the proof that while she'd been collecting social credentials, we'd been doing actual good with our money. It wasn't the main weapon, but it was additional ammunition to show what kind of person she'd become. Sunday morning arrived with perfect weather, the kind of bright May day that Connecticut does so well. Lorraine had sent Mark to pick us up, not trusting us to drive ourselves. She'd arranged everything at her house, a modern minimalist place in West Hartford that she'd bought with money we'd loaned her, money she'd never fully repaid. The gathering was exactly as pretentious as I'd imagined. About 30 people milled around her living room, all Heritage Club members, all dressed in expensive casual wear that probably cost more than our first car. I recognized most of them from newspaper society pages. The Hendersons, who owned half the commercial real estate downtown, Patricia Worthington, whose family founded one of the original Connecticut mills, James and Caroline Ashford, who traced their lineage to colonial governors. These were the people Lorraine had spent years impressing. The ones who'd finally accepted her into their circle because she was a Caldwell, because her grandfather-in-law had been the legendary Langston Caldwell, real estate magnate and philanthropist. She introduced us around with barely concealed impatience, positioning us as the beloved but aging parents who were graciously passing the torch to the next generation. Everyone smiled with that particular blend of pity and condescension that people reserve for the elderly. Preston the notary had set up a signing table near the window, complete with a decorative pen that probably cost more than the documents were worth. Lorraine's lawyer stood nearby, a sharp woman in a designer suit who kept checking her watch. I noticed Silas arrive quietly through the side entrance. He wasn't dressed for a party. He wore his courtroom suit, the severe black one he saved for serious cases. 2 people accompanied him, both carrying briefcases. Lorraine noticed him too. Her smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered, walking over to greet him with false warmth. She asked why he'd brought associates to a family gathering. Silas told her he always brought witnesses to legal proceedings. That's what this was, wasn't it? A legal transfer of assets? The room had gone quiet. People were watching now, sensing something off about the situation. Lorraine laughed it off, gesturing everyone to gather around for the signing. She wanted them all to witness this moment, she said. The moment when she officially became the steward of the Caldwell legacy. I walked to the table, Cornelius beside me, both of us moving slowly, like the old people we were. Then I picked up that expensive pen and set it back down without signing anything. The room held its breath as I stood at that table, not signing. Lorraine's smile had frozen on her face, the kind of expression that comes right before panic sets in. I told the gathering that before we signed anything, I wanted to share a story about family, about legacy, about what the Caldwell name really meant. Lorraine tried to interrupt, her voice rising with forced cheer as she told everyone that her mother sometimes got confused, that I liked to ramble about the past, that we should just proceed with the signing. Patricia Worthington actually patted my hand with that condescending gentleness people use on senile relatives. But Silas stepped forward then, positioning himself between me and Lorraine. He informed the room that as the Caldwell's attorney of record for 3 decades, he had some concerns about this transfer that needed to be addressed before any signatures were made. Lorraine's lawyer objected, claiming this was a private family matter. Silas responded that false imprisonment and elder coercion were criminal matters, and he had evidence of both. That got everyone's attention. The room wasn't quiet anymore. It buzzed with whispers and sharp intakes of breath. These people lived for scandal, as long as it wasn't about them. Silas's associate set up a laptop on the coffee table and pulled up the security footage. The timestamp showed Tuesday afternoon, 4 days earlier. The video was crystal clear, Mark leading us down the basement stairs, Lorraine following, the door slamming shut. The audio caught her voice through the door, cold and threatening, informing us we'd stay there until we cooperated. You could have heard a pin drop. Several people had their phones out, probably already texting about this bombshell. The Hendersons had moved closer to the door, ready to leave. Caroline Ashford looked horrified, her hand pressed to her chest. Lorraine's face had gone white. She started talking fast, spinning explanations. We'd been confused, wandering toward a dangerous part of the basement. She'd been protecting us from ourselves. Mark backed her up, his voice desperate, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But Silas played more footage, hours of it, compressed into minutes. Lorraine and Mark searching through our belongings upstairs. Lorraine on the phone with Preston, laughing about how easily she'd trapped us. Mark suggesting they leave us down there overnight to really break our spirits. Preston the notary had gone pale and was quietly gathering his things, clearly wanting to distance himself from this disaster. I let the footage speak for itself, watching Lorraine's social standing crumble in real time. These people valued propriety above all else. You could be ruthless in business, cold in your personal dealings, as long as you maintained the appearance of respectability. But elder abuse? Imprisoning your own parents? That was beyond the pale. James Ashford stood up and announced he was leaving. Patricia Worthington followed, both of them avoiding Lorraine's desperate attempts to explain. Others were whispering, creating distance. But I wasn't finished. The false imprisonment was just the opening act. I asked the remaining guests if they knew why the Caldwell name carried such weight in Connecticut, why Langston Caldwell had been so respected, why families like theirs had accepted him into their circle despite him being newer money than most of them. Lorraine was begging me to stop, her voice cracking. She could see where this was going, could sense the trap closing. I pulled out the copies Silas had made, enlarged, printed on quality paper, impossible to dispute. Langston Caldwell's letter, explaining in his own handwriting how he'd adopted young Cornelius Thorne in 1951 to save the boy from scandal. The room had emptied to about 15 people now, but those who remained were the real power players, the ones whose opinions shaped Hartford society. They leaned in, reading Langston's words, seeing his distinctive signature at the bottom, I explained how Orion Thorne had been arrested for espionage, how the case had made national headlines, how Langston had erased that history to give a child a better life. It had been an act of kindness, really, saving a boy from his father's mistakes. But it meant that Cornelius wasn't a Caldwell by blood, which meant Lorraine wasn't either. I watched her face as the implications sank in. She'd built everything on that name: her Heritage Club membership, her board positions, her entire social identity. She'd introduced herself at charity galas as a descendant of Connecticut's founding families. She'd dropped the Caldwell name like currency, and now everyone knew it was borrowed. She was the granddaughter of a convicted spy, wearing a name that wasn't hers by blood. Patricia Worthington, who'd returned to witness this revelation, made a small sound of disgust. The Heritage Club had strict membership criteria, she mentioned. Documented lineage was required. Misrepresenting one's family history was grounds for immediate expulsion. Caroline Ashford added that the Historical Society Board would need to review Lorraine's position as well, given this new information about her actual ancestry. Lorraine was crying now, her perfectly applied makeup running, her hands shaking as she tried to formulate some response. Mark had backed away from her, already calculating his exit strategy from a sinking ship. But I still wasn't done, because I needed everyone to understand not just what she'd tried to take from us, but why. I turned to address the remaining crowd, my voice steady despite the enormity of what I was doing. It was time to show them who my daughter really was. I opened the folder I'd brought from home, the one with 50 years of donation records and charitable contributions. I handed copies to Patricia Worthington and James Ashford, letting them see the pattern while I explained it to the room. Over 5 decades, Cornelius and I had given away roughly $4 million. Not to organizations that would put our names on plaques or give us board seats, but to causes that actually needed the money: children's hospitals, homeless shelters, scholarship funds for kids who couldn't afford college. We'd done it quietly, through our business, because we believed that's what you did when you had more than enough. Lorraine, on the other hand, had given exactly enough to meet the Heritage Club's annual minimum requirement and secure her board position at the Historical Society. Her donations were strategic, calculated to buy status rather than help people. I watched the room's expression shift as they processed this. These people might have been social climbers, but they understood the difference between actual philanthropy and purchasing access. Patricia asked Lorraine directly how much she'd contributed to the preservation fund last year. Lorraine stammered something about $20,000. Patricia's eyebrows rose. That was barely above the minimum, and everyone knew it. Then I played my final card before the confrontation. I asked Silas to explain what Lorraine had tried to steal. Silas laid it out in terms everyone could understand. The power of attorney documents would have given Lorraine complete control of our assets: 20 commercial properties worth approximately $30 million, stocks and bonds worth another $8 million, and our personal residence valued at $1 million. She'd attempted to obtain this through coercion and false imprisonment. But more than that, she'd planned to have us declared mentally incompetent. Silas had obtained emails between Lorraine and a psychiatrist she'd consulted, asking about the process for getting elderly parents declared unfit. She'd already scheduled evaluations, hired a specialist known for testifying in favor of family members in competency hearings. Her plan had been thorough: lock us up, break us down, force us to sign, then use our supposed confusion during the imprisonment as evidence we were losing our minds. Transfer everything to her control, place us in a facility, and take over the Caldwell Properties empire she felt entitled to inherit. Mark had started edging toward the door. Several people looked at him with open disgust. The Hendersons, who'd come back when they heard the commotion, were filming on their phones now. Lorraine collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands. She kept saying she was sorry, that she'd never meant for things to go this far, that she'd just wanted to help manage things for us. But her tears rang hollow. Everyone in that room had seen the security footage of her laughing on the phone, had heard her cold voice through the basement door. I told the room I wanted them to understand something important. My husband was dying. His emphysema was terminal, a slow suffocation that would take him from me within a year. We'd known this for months, had made our peace with it. What Lorraine had done, locking us in that cold basement, had accelerated his decline. The dust and dampness had triggered an infection in his lungs that might have been avoided. She'd literally shortened her own father's life out of greed and impatience. Cornelius spoke then, his voice rough but clear enough to be heard. He said he'd spent 70 years being ashamed of his real father, carrying the weight of Orion Thorne's crimes like they were his own. Langston had saved him, given him a new life, but that life had been built on hiding the truth. He wasn't ashamed anymore. Orion Thorne had been falsely accused, his research stolen by actual spies who'd framed him to cover their tracks. New evidence had emerged in the 1990s, documents declassified after the Cold War ended, proving Orion's innocence. But by then, he'd already died in prison, his name permanently tarnished. Cornelius had spent years researching his biological father's case, collecting proof of the injustice done to him. He'd never published it, never cleared the Thorne name publicly, because he'd promised Langston to keep the secret. But promises to the dead don't matter as much as protecting what you've built while alive. He told Lorraine she'd forced his hand. If she'd been patient, waited for nature to take its course, she might have inherited everything legitimately. Instead, she'd gotten greedy. She'd treated her parents like obstacles to be removed rather than people who'd loved and raised her. The room was completely silent now. Patricia Worthington had tears in her eyes. Even Caroline Ashford, known for her ice-cold composure, looked shaken. I announced to everyone present that we were revoking any previous estate plans that included Lorraine. Everything would go to our younger children and to charity. Lorraine would receive exactly $1 and a formal disinheritance. More than that, Silas would be filing criminal charges for false imprisonment, attempted fraud, and elder abuse. Lorraine looked up at me then, her face destroyed, mascara streaking her cheeks. She tried to speak, to apologize or plead or something, but no words came out. Mark had vanished entirely, probably already calling a divorce lawyer. The guests were leaving now, filing out with their phones blazing, already spreading the news through Hartford's social networks. The Caldwell scandal would be the talk of every club and charity board for months. As the last of them left, I sat down next to my husband and took his hand. Tomorrow, we'd deal with the legal proceedings. Tonight, we'd won. The aftermath of Sunday's confrontation moved faster than I'd expected. By Monday morning, Lorraine had been formally expelled from the Heritage Club. Patricia Worthington had called an emergency board meeting Sunday evening, and the vote was unanimous. The Historical Society revoked her board position by Tuesday. The social death was immediate and total. Women who'd lunched with her last week crossed the street to avoid her. The country club asked her to return her membership card. Even her hairdresser suddenly had no available appointments. But the legal consequences took longer to unfold, and that's where the real justice happened. Wednesday, Silas filed a criminal complaint with the Hartford County prosecutor. The security footage made it an easy case. You could watch the crime happen in real time. The prosecutor, a woman named Sandra Chen, who'd built her career on elder abuse cases, took it personally. She told me during our first meeting that she'd seen too many families destroy their parents for money. Lorraine and Mark weren't unique. They were just careless enough to get caught on camera. Thursday, the police arrested both of them. Mark at his office, Lorraine at home. The mugshots appeared on local news that evening. In Lorraine's photo, her hair was disheveled, her eyes red from crying, looking nothing like the polished society woman she'd pretended to be. The charges were serious: false imprisonment, coercion, attempted fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse. Mark faced additional charges for his role in planning and executing the scheme. Preston, the notary, turned state's evidence immediately, providing emails and text messages showing how Lorraine had recruited him to prepare fraudulent documents. He'd get probation in exchange for testimony. I felt no sympathy for him. But the trial itself, When it finally happened in August was where everything came together. The prosecutor presented the security footage first, letting the jury watch Lorraine lock her elderly parents in a basement. Several jurors visibly reacted, one older woman shaking her head in disgust. Then Silas testified about the documents Lorraine had prepared, explaining how the power of attorney was designed to strip us of all control while appearing legitimate. An expert witness broke down the financial aspects, how much Lorraine stood to gain, how she'd already started moving assets before we'd even signed. The defense tried to paint us as vindictive parents who'd turned on their loving daughter over a misunderstanding. Lorraine's lawyer suggested we were angry about the revelation of Cornelius's adoption, that we were lashing out in embarrassment. But then the prosecutor called her surprise witness, a private investigator Lorraine had hired 6 months earlier. His testimony destroyed her defense. He'd been paid to investigate our daily routines, document our activities, note any signs of confusion or forgetfulness. Lorraine had been planning this for half a year, methodically building a case for incompetency, waiting for the right moment to strike. The investigator had recordings of his conversations with Lorraine. In one, she complained about how long her parents were taking to die naturally, how she couldn't wait another 10 years for her inheritance. In another, she discussed strategies for isolating us from friends and other family members who might interfere with her plans. The jury heard her voice, cold and calculating, discussing her parents like we were investment properties to be liquidated. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Cornelius testified from a wheelchair, his breathing labored but his mind sharp. He explained how the basement's conditions had triggered the lung infection that had hospitalized him twice since the incident. Medical experts confirmed that the exposure had accelerated his decline. I testified last, walking the jury through 53 years of marriage, 3 children raised, an empire built through honest work. I told them about finding Lorraine's first tooth, teaching her to ride a bike, paying for her wedding. I explained how it felt to hear your own daughter laugh about trapping you in darkness while she ransacked your home. I didn't cry. I'd used up my tears months ago. I just spoke the truth. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Lorraine got 6 years in state prison. Mark got 5. The judge, a stern woman in her 70s, told Lorraine she'd violated the most sacred trust that exists, the one between parent and child. She said that in 40 years on the bench, she'd seen murders that disgusted her less than what Lorraine had done. Lorraine cried through the sentencing, begging for mercy, claiming she'd made mistakes but didn't deserve prison. The judge denied her request for probation. As they led her away in handcuffs, Lorraine looked back at me one last time. I couldn't read her expression. Regret, maybe. Or just self-pity. I didn't particularly care anymore. Mark went to a different facility. I heard later that he'd filed for divorce from prison, trying to distance himself from the Caldwell scandal. The divorce was granted within months. The civil suit came next. Silas filed for damages, compensation for our suffering, the cost of Cornelius's medical care, emotional distress. The judge awarded us $3 million to be paid from Lorraine's future earnings for the rest of her life. She'd never pay it off. She'd work until she died, sending money to parents she'd tried to destroy, forever reminded of her crime. By then, it was late September. Cornelius was in hospice care at home, surrounded by our things, in the house we'd built. He could barely speak, the oxygen mask covering his face almost constantly. But on his last day, he squeezed my hand and smiled. He died knowing our legacy was protected, knowing the truth had finally come out, knowing that justice had been served. Cornelius passed away on October 15th, with me holding his hand and our younger children, Margaret and Tom, sitting beside his bed. It was peaceful, as much as suffocation can ever be peaceful. His last words were so quiet, I had to lean in close to hear them. He told me he loved me, that I'd been magnificent, that I should live the rest of my years without regret. I buried him next to his adoptive father, Langston, in Grove Cemetery. The funeral was private, just family and close friends. Lorraine petitioned for release to attend, but the judge denied her request. Mark didn't bother asking. Margaret and Tom had been shocked by everything that happened with their sister. They'd known Lorraine had become obsessed with status, but they never imagined she'd go so far. In the months after the trial, they helped me reorganize the business, ensuring Caldwell Properties would continue operating smoothly without Cornelius at the helm. Tom, who'd been managing the Portland branch of our business for years, moved back to Connecticut to take over day-to-day operations. Margaret, a corporate attorney in Boston, started handling our legal affairs, gradually taking over from Silas as he approached retirement. We established the Cornelius Thorne Caldwell Foundation in December, funded with $5 million from our estate. The foundation's mission was to support children of incarcerated parents, giving them scholarships, mentoring, opportunities that Cornelius never had after his father was imprisoned. We made sure Orion Thorne's name appeared in the foundation materials, finally giving him credit for the brilliant scientist he'd been before false accusations destroyed his life. The Historical Society, embarrassed by their treatment of Cornelius once his real story became public, wanted to do a full exhibition about the Thorne case and the injustice of the Red Scare. I let them, on the condition that they hire young historians, and made it free for school groups. It opened in March to significant media attention. As for our properties, I sold 3 of them and donated the proceeds to elder abuse prevention programs across Connecticut. The remaining 17 buildings now fund a trust that provides legal assistance to seniors facing exploitation from family members. Silas helped me structure it before he retired, ensuring it would continue long after I was gone. I kept our Victorian home, the one Lorraine had wanted so badly. I spent months transforming it, making it mine rather than ours. The basement, where we'd been imprisoned, became something different. I hired contractors to turn it into a bright studio apartment that I now rent to a young teacher for below market rate. She's saving money for graduate school and doesn't know the room's history. I like having life and laughter in that space that was once so dark. Preston, the notary who'd cooperated with the prosecution, had his license permanently revoked. Last I heard, he was working as a store manager somewhere in New Haven. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, just a vague relief that he couldn't enable someone else's crimes. Patricia Worthington and I became unlikely friends. She'd been horrified by her own blindness to Lorraine's true nature and started volunteering with me at the foundation. She used her social connections for good, raising money and awareness for our cause. She told me once, over tea in my garden, that watching me stand up to my own daughter had made her reconsider what strength really looked like at our age. I traveled some in the months after Cornelius died. Nothing exotic, just places we'd always talked about visiting. I spent 2 weeks in Santa Fe looking at art, a month in Charleston walking through gardens, 3 weeks in Northern California wine country, staying at small inns and reading books I'd never had time for during 50 years of running a business. But I always came back to Connecticut, to the house filled with memories both terrible and beautiful. Tom met someone, a kind woman named Jessica who worked as a nurse and treated me like actual family rather than an obligation. They're engaged now. Margaret's children, my grandchildren who'd remained loyal throughout the scandal, visit most weekends. We bake together, garden together, talk about everything from politics to their dating lives. I turned 80 in April. The celebration was small but genuine. People who actually cared about me rather than what my name could do for them. Lorraine sent a card from prison. It contained a long letter apologizing, explaining, trying to make me understand how the pressure to maintain her social position had driven her to desperation. She claimed she'd never meant to hurt us, that things had spiraled out of control. I read it once, then filed it with the other legal documents from her case. I didn't respond. Some bridges once burned aren't worth rebuilding. Now I spend my mornings in what used to be the basement but is now my office, writing these memories. Not for publication or profit, but because I want my grandchildren to know the full story someday. I want them to understand that age doesn't diminish you unless you let it, that family loyalty has limits when it enables cruelty, and that sometimes the hardest thing you can do is stand up to the people who are supposed to love you most. The Victorian house stands solid on its foundation, just as it has for 47 years. The azaleas bloom every spring. The maple tree Cornelius planted in 1980 shades the front porch. The basement studio apartment glows with light from new windows I had installed. I'm 80 years old, a widow, a grandmother, a survivor of my own daughter's betrayal. I own 17 commercial properties, run a foundation, volunteer weekly at the legal clinic, and take yoga classes on Tuesday mornings with other women my age who've lived full, complicated lives. People sometimes ask if I'm lonely in this big house by myself. I tell them I'm alone, which is different. Loneliness is painful. Being alone is just peaceful. Last week, a young woman from the prosecutor's office came to interview me for a training program they're developing on elder abuse. She wanted to know what signs people should watch for, how families could protect themselves. I told her the truth. Watch for people who start treating you like you're incompetent before you actually are, who make decisions about your life without including you in the conversation, who see your age as an opportunity rather than a stage of life deserving respect. And I told her that if it happens, if your own family turns on you, don't be afraid to fight back with every resource you have. Dignity isn't given, it's taken and held on to with both hands. This house is mine. This life is mine. The legacy Cornelius and I built belongs to people who'll actually honor it. And somewhere in a Connecticut prison, my daughter is learning that 79 years of life teaches you exactly where all the bodies are buried and how to dig them up when you need them. If you're watching from anywhere in the world where family means something but betrayal happens anyway, remember this story. Subscribe to hear more about how ordinary people handle extraordinary situations. And leave me a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'd love to know this message is reaching people who need to hear it. Because at 80 years old, I've learned the most important lesson. Never underestimate someone who's survived this long. We didn't get here by being weak.